What is an AET? It's a technique where the client contracts their muscle while you simultaneously compress down into it. And in my 20 years of experience, otherwise known as my clients, and in my lab, otherwise known as my office, I've found it to be one of the most effective techniques out there. So this is the part where I plug my butter because it really does allow me to grip the tissues underneath the skin and work more effectively. So I will include the link for that in the description below. But in the meantime, this is a video about an active engagement technique, and I'm going to start by demoing on the upper traps and the levator scapula. The traps are big and complicated, but for the upper traps, one of the main actions is to shrug the shoulder up to the ear and then also bring the head and neck back down to the shoulder. So I'm asking my client to do both of those actions as I compress down into the fibers of the upper traps. And then when she releases, I sink in and I'm able to work a little bit deeper into those fibers. There's definitely a handful of muscles in the neck that do similar actions, so you want to try to delineate as much as you can what muscle you're targeting. And because I just focused on the upper traps, I want to sink down into the levator scapula, but that needs to look different and feel different to my client. I've pushed aside the belly of the upper trap fibers, and as I sink down into the attachment site of the levator scapula onto the superior angle of the scapula itself, I'm asking her to shrug her shoulder up to her ear because that's what the levator scapula does. It elevates the scapula. And then when she releases, I sink down even deeper and I'm able to compress down into these fibers that have now let go beyond their normal state. I'm getting ready to demo this on the bicep in a lot more detail actually, but before I do that, I want to explain that the theory behind this work is that when a client contracts their muscle and then lets it relax, it lets go beyond their normal state of holding. So using that knowledge to our advantage, when it contracts as we're compressing in and then they relax, the fibers are loosening their grip and the depth to which you can sink is a lot greater. So one of the actions of the biceps is to flex the elbow. So I'm going to bring her arm into that position, and that makes it easy for me to apply a resistance. So I'm going to use my left hand here to hold her wrist and ask her to bring her own wrist towards her shoulder. And I'm using my right hand to compress into the biceps. I've switched my grip mainly because I want to show you that you can use either hand to do either part of this technique. And I also want to point out that right now her palm is facing towards her shoulder, which really isolates the biceps away from the other muscles that bring the elbow into flexion. Enter the brachialis and the brachioradialis. Now the brachialis actually does elbow flexion with the forearm supinated, but I've pronated my client's arm because I want to A, access the origin of the brachioradialis, and B, with her forearm pronated, the biceps call into action stabilization of the shoulder. So with a slight twist of the forearm, I'm not only accessing different muscles, but I'm also accessing different fibers within the muscles that I'm targeting. I'm employing a little bit of a pin and stretch here in the end, and if you want to see how to do that technique, I'll include the link in the description below, but feel free to play around with this technique in combination with other techniques. And because I promised you detail, I'm showing you another approach for an AET with the biceps. So this time, instead of sinking into the tissue, I'm grabbing the biceps between my fingers and my thumb and using that as a compression as I ask her to actively engage, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, her muscles by flexing her elbow. I'm going to repeat this, but I want you to notice the engagement of the shoulder as she contracts her biceps. So even though there's no active motion at the shoulder joint, there is stabilization happening and the entirety of the biceps are engaged. So depending on what your client needs, you can kind of play around with which approach to this technique works best for them. But wait, there's more. Just to show you more detail about how to work this muscle, the biceps come down and insert into the tuberosity of the radius and then have a little aponeurosis that expands from there. So I'm going to sink into that spot. I'm going to ask my client to supinate her forearm as I'm resisting it into pronation, and I can feel that attachment site trigger. And again, once she relaxes, I sink deeper and can do more work. The point is, you can apply this technique within all the nuanced aspects of a muscle. I've said it once and I'll say it 1,000 times more. If you know your anatomy and you know your physiology, you can begin to integrate your practice. Moving down into the forearm, there are about 20 muscles in the forearm alone, so you could see how you could spend so much time just in this area. And just to make it simple, I'm going to focus on the extensors, and I'm not going to actually have her extend her wrist. Instead, I'm going to have her make a fist. And this not only engages the muscles I'm targeting, but it also creates a stabilization throughout the entire forearm, which can be a broader approach to using this technique. I'm not going to be quite as detailed with these muscles, but I am going to show you quickly a different perspective from a different approach. So instead I'm standing facing my client's forearm, having her make a fist and sinking in when she releases that fist. Like I mentioned before, there are so many muscles here, and you can take your time and apply this technique throughout the forearm on all the muscles. But I want to demo on a couple more muscles, so I have moved down to the leg. The most prominent job of the quads is to extend the knee straight, but these muscles are huge and really encompass most of the upper leg. So if you feel like your client needs this work on this muscle group, take some time to figure out exactly where the issue is and explore which of the 4 quads needs to be targeted. So for that first activation, if you could see, my right hand was on the anterior aspect of her ankle, and so when she kicked her leg straight, I held resistance, pushing her leg back down to the table. I was also using my left thumb to focus on the vastus medialis. But for the second pass, I'm going to use a soft fist and keep my intention a little more broad, so compressing down into the vastus intermedius and the rectus femoris, and then when she relaxes these muscles, I'm really leaning in and sliding up towards the origin and creating a nice deep release of tension. So all of these muscles come down and form this really strong tendon just under the kneecap and attach into the tibial tuberosity. And just because they are not the muscles themselves, the tendon still has the ability to send responses to the brain. So I'm going to do an AET here as well. I'm using specific points to sink down into the patellar tendon as she extends her knee straight, and then when she releases, I'm doing a little friction to break apart that connective tissue and then fleshing out the knee itself. And then finally moving down into the lower leg. I'm going to start with the tibialis anterior, and because this muscle pulls the foot up into dorsiflexion, that's what I'm going to have my client do. So I'm sinking into this muscle, and I'm using one thumb to support my other thumb as she contracts by pulling her toes up towards her knees, and then, yep, you guessed it, when she releases, I sink down a little bit deeper. So I can move up the muscle and do this pretty methodically to ensure that I'm really getting the entirety of all of the fibers of this muscle, and I can combine this with other techniques, but I want to create length. So as I slide up towards her knee, I'm pulling her foot down into plantar flexion, which elongates the tibialis anterior and completes the intention of my work. Before I dive into the last muscle, I just want to say that one of the reasons why I love this technique is because it gives the client a sense of working together to loosen things up and to resolve pain issues. When they're lying on the table and not doing anything while you're working on them, it's a very one-sided interaction, and healing, from my perspective, is teamwork. If you haven't guessed it already, the last muscles that I'm focusing on are the peroneals, which bring the foot out into eversion. So I just showed her what I wanted her to do, and I'm finding these little ropey muscles with my thumb and sinking in while she brings the outside of her foot up to the outside of her knee. So these are pretty long, stringy muscles, and muscles like these have a pretty high connective tissue to muscle fiber ratio. So when she releases the contraction, I'm focusing a little bit more on friction as opposed to compression, because that is what connective tissue likes. I could demo this technique on all of the muscles that we as body workers tend to focus on, but if you listen to your client, figure out the muscles that they're really talking about, and apply the steps of an AET, you're good to go. Hey guys, if you like this video and you want to see more content like this, please consider heading over to my Patreon page. The support I get from Patreon makes it possible for me to do these videos, and I'm always trying to dive in deeper and create better content for you that is educational, interesting, and entertaining. So click on the link, and I hope to see you over there.